I used to do exactly what almost everyone still does today. Every time I trimmed a tree or cleaned up after a storm, I gathered all the old branches into one pile and either burned them or paid someone to haul them away. I honestly believed they were nothing more than useless waste taking up space. Looking back now, I realize I was throwing away something that could have made my garden more beautiful, saved me money, helped my plants, and even filled the yard with birds and helpful insects without buying expensive decorations or fancy garden products. If you are still getting rid of old branches, I want you to stay with me, because by the end of this video, you may never look at a pile of wood the same way again. What I am about to share is not complicated, and it does not require special tools or woodworking skills. These are simple ideas that were shown to me many years ago by an older neighbor who always had the warmest-looking garden in the whole area. His yard never looked expensive, but somehow everyone wanted to spend time there. Birds sang from morning until evening, butterflies seemed to appear from nowhere, and even his vegetable beds looked healthier than mine. At first, I thought he had some secret fertilizer or special plants, but the real secret was lying in neat little stacks of branches all around his property. Most people walk past those things without giving them a second thought. That is the mistake. Old wood is not just wood. It can become a quiet helper that works every single day without asking for attention. It can create shelter, protect the soil, attract life, and make every corner of a garden feel calmer and more welcoming. The best part is that almost everything costs nothing, because you are simply using what nature has already given you. I know many people over 50 are looking for ways to improve the garden without spending more money every season, and this is exactly why I wanted to make this video. I will show you several simple methods that anyone can do little by little at their own pace. Some of them are almost forgotten now, and very few people still use them, even though they work surprisingly well. But before I show you the first one, there is one common mistake that ruins the result before people even begin, and avoiding that mistake changes everything. The mistake I see most often is that people try to make everything look too neat. The moment they cut a branch, they trim it into perfect pieces or throw away anything that looks twisted bent or covered with old bark. That is exactly backwards. Nature has never cared about perfect shapes, and neither do the birds, the bees, or the helpful insects that quietly make our gardens healthier. Many years ago, an old friend smiled when he saw me cutting every branch into equal lengths. He told me to stop before I ruined the best parts. At the time, I thought he was joking, but after I followed his advice, I started noticing changes that surprised me. The first thing he showed me was to keep the strongest branches with interesting natural shapes. Some had little forks, some had rough bark, and others curved in ways I never would have planned myself. Instead of hiding them, he placed them near flower beds, vegetable patches, and quiet corners of the yard. At first, they looked simple, but after a few weeks they blended into the garden so naturally that visitors thought they had always been there. Even more surprising, small birds began landing on them every morning before flying down to search for insects around the vegetables. That alone made a noticeable difference because the birds were helping with pests without me doing anything. Very few people do this today because most of us have been taught that every decoration should come from a store. We spend money on artificial ornaments, metal sculptures, and expensive garden pieces, while perfectly good natural materials are lying on the ground after every pruning season. There is another small detail that most people miss. Never use freshly painted wood or treated lumber for these projects because those materials are not meant for living gardens. I always choose clean, natural branches that have simply dried for a while. They last much longer than many people expect, and they fit into the landscape without looking forced. Another thing I learned is that you do not need to build everything in one afternoon. Every season I add one small piece somewhere in the garden, and over time the whole place feels warmer and more welcoming. It costs almost nothing, but each little change builds on the last one. And there is one project I always make first, because it not only looks beautiful, but quietly helps flowers, vegetables, birds, and beneficial insects all at the same time. Almost nobody notices why it works until they see the results with their own eyes. The first project I always build is something that looks almost too simple to matter. I choose several thicker branches and push them firmly into the ground so they stand upright. Then I weave smaller branches between them without worrying about making everything perfectly straight. I leave little gaps here and there because those spaces are exactly what many small creatures are looking for. When I finished my first one, I honestly thought it looked a little rough compared to the expensive wooden decorations I had seen in magazines. Then something interesting happened. Within a few weeks, tiny birds started using it as a safe place to rest before flying into the vegetable beds. Ladybugs appeared more often than I had ever noticed before. Bees landed on nearby flowers and seemed to stay around longer. I cannot say that one simple branch fence solved every problem in my garden, but I can honestly say the whole place began to feel more alive. An older gardener showed me this method many years ago, and he called it one of the forgotten habits that people stopped using when gardens became more about appearance than nature. He told me that every healthy garden needs quiet places where useful creatures can hide from wind, rain, and larger animals. Most people remove every stick, every leaf, and every fallen branch because they think a perfectly clean garden is always the best garden. In reality, many helpful insects disappear when there is nowhere safe for them to live. That simple woven structure becomes much more than a decoration. It softens the look of the garden, breaks up empty spaces, and creates a comfortable shelter without costing more than a little time. I usually place one near flowers and another close to my vegetable beds because that is where I want birds and beneficial insects to spend their time. Little by little, they become part of the garden itself. Moss begins growing on some of the older branches, and climbing plants often find their own way onto the structure without any help from me. Every season, it looks a little better than the year before. That is something you rarely get from decorations bought in a store. They usually start looking older with time, while these simple natural structures seem to become more beautiful as they age. But there is another forgotten use for old branches that surprised me even more, because instead of standing above the ground, they disappear beneath plants and quietly improve the garden, where almost nobody can see them until the results begin to show. One of my favorite old methods is so simple that many people walk right past it without realizing how useful it can be. Instead of throwing smaller branches into a pile, I place them carefully around shrubs, fruit trees, and even some of my vegetable beds. I do not stack them too tightly because I want air and rain to move through them naturally. At first glance, it may look like nothing more than a few scattered sticks, but after a little time, you begin to notice what is happening underneath. The soil stays cooler during hot days, and it does not dry out as quickly after the sun comes up. When heavy rain falls, the branches soften the impact and help keep the soil from washing away. I learned this from a man who had been gardening for longer than I had been alive. He laughed when people rushed to buy expensive garden edging, while perfectly good branches were lying on the ground for free. He always told me that nature rarely wastes anything, and gardeners should not either. Most people make a mistake here because they pile the branches too high or press them tightly against the trunk of a tree. I never do that. I always leave a little space around the base because the trunk needs air, and I do not want moisture staying against the bark for long periods. That small detail makes a big difference over the years. Another thing I have noticed is that these branch borders slowly become home to small living creatures that actually help the garden. You may see tiny beetles hiding underneath during the day, or hear birds searching between the branches early in the morning. Those birds are not there by accident. They are looking for insects to feed themselves and their young, and while they do that, they are also helping protect nearby plants. Very few people think about creating these quiet places because they expect nature to arrive on its own. Sometimes it does, but often it needs a simple invitation. Old branches provide exactly that without costing a single dollar. As the seasons pass, the wood slowly breaks down and becomes part of the soil, while new branches from yearly pruning take its place. It becomes a natural cycle that repeats itself without much effort. My garden feels calmer because of it, and visitors often tell me they cannot explain why it seems so comfortable to walk through. They think it is the flowers or the vegetables, but I quietly smile because I know these forgotten pieces of wood are doing far more than anyone realizes. And there is one final idea that changed the way I look at every fallen branch after a storm, because it brings together beauty wildlife and practical gardening in one simple project that almost anyone can build in an afternoon. The project that probably brings me the most satisfaction is something many people would never even think about building. I take several larger logs or thick branches that are no longer useful for firewood and arrange them in a quiet corner of the garden. I place the biggest pieces on the bottom and then add smaller branches across the top without making everything too tidy. I leave small openings between them because those little spaces become safe hiding places for birds, insects, and other tiny creatures that belong in a healthy garden. When I first tried this, I expected it to stay exactly as I built it, but nature had other plans. Within a few months, moss began appearing on the shaded side. Small wildflowers found places to grow nearby, and birds started visiting that corner almost every day. It slowly turned into one of the most peaceful spots in my yard without costing me anything except a little time. An older gardener once told me that every garden should have at least one place where nature is allowed to do a little of the work on its own. At the time, I did not fully understand what he meant, but now I do. We spend so much effort trying to control every inch of our gardens that we sometimes forget the garden itself wants to help us if we simply give it the chance. Most people make a mistake here because they build these little wood piles right in the middle of busy walkways or where they are constantly disturbed. I always choose a quiet place that stays fairly peaceful during the day. That gives birds confidence to visit and allows beneficial insects to settle without being bothered all the time. Another small detail that many people overlook is leaving a few pieces standing upright instead of laying everything flat. Those upright branches become perfect resting places where birds can watch the garden before flying down to search for insects among the vegetables or flower beds. Every year, I notice more life returning without planting anything extra or buying special products. The entire garden feels balanced in a quiet, natural way. Visitors often ask where I bought certain decorations because they blend so well into the landscape. They are always surprised when I tell them everything came from branches that most people would have thrown away after pruning trees. That is probably my favorite part, because it reminds me that beauty does not always come from spending money. Sometimes it comes from seeing ordinary things differently. And before we finish, there is one final lesson that completely changed the way I think about old wood, because it has very little to do with decoration and everything to do with how a garden makes you feel every single day. As the years passed, I stopped looking at my garden as a place that always needed more things from the store. Instead, I began paying closer attention to what the garden was already giving me. Every pruning season became an opportunity instead of another chore. A pile of branches no longer meant extra work or another trip to the dump. It meant new borders for flower beds, another resting place for birds, a simple support for climbing plants, or a quiet shelter where helpful insects could spend the season. The more I followed these old habits, the more natural everything began to feel. I also noticed something else that I never expected. Spending time building these simple projects slowed me down in the best possible way. There was no pressure to finish everything in one weekend. I would carry a few branches, place them where they looked right, step back, and return another day if I wanted to change something. That slower pace made gardening much more enjoyable, especially as I got older. I no longer felt that I had to keep buying new decorations every spring because the garden itself was changing with each season. Fresh green leaves appeared around old branches in spring. Summer flowers softened every structure. Autumn covered them with warm colors, and even winter gave the wood its own quiet beauty. Very few people realize that the best-looking gardens often grow slowly over many years instead of appearing all at once. Another thing that surprised me was how much money I quietly saved without really thinking about it. I stopped buying expensive edging decorative fences, wooden ornaments, and many other things that had once seemed necessary. The materials were already lying in my own yard after trimming trees or cleaning up after storms. Instead of paying to throw them away, I found simple ways to use them again. That feeling of creating something useful from what others call waste brings a kind of satisfaction that is difficult to explain until you experience it yourself. The garden feels more personal because every piece has its own small story. Some branches came from an old apple tree, while others came from a maple that shaded the yard for decades. They became part of the garden instead of disappearing forever. Even today, when I walk outside with my morning coffee and hear birds singing from those old branches, I quietly smile because I remember how close I came to throwing all of them away. And there is one final thought I want to leave with you because it completely changed the way I see, not only my garden, but also the simple value hidden inside ordinary things that most people never notice. If there is one thing I hope you remember after watching this video, it is that a beautiful and welcoming garden does not have to cost a fortune. Some of the best improvements I have ever made started with things that other people considered useless. A few old branches, a little patience, and the willingness to try an old forgotten idea completely changed the way my garden feels every season. Today, I no longer rush to clear every stick from the ground, because I know each one might become something useful. One may support climbing flowers. Another may become a simple border around vegetables. A larger branch may give a bird a safe place to rest before it helps me by searching for insects among my plants. None of these ideas are difficult, and none of them require expensive tools or special skills. That is exactly why I enjoy them so much. They remind me that gardening has always been about working with nature instead of constantly trying to replace it with products from a store. If you start with only one small project this week, you will probably notice the same thing I did. The garden begins to feel warmer, quieter, and somehow more alive. Then, little by little, you will find yourself looking at every fallen branch differently, because instead of seeing waste, you will start seeing possibilities. That simple change of thinking is perhaps the greatest lesson an older gardener ever shared with me, and I am grateful that I listened. Every season adds something new without forcing me to spend more money than necessary. I believe that is something many of us appreciate even more as the years go by. We learn that comfort does not always come from buying something new. Quite often it comes from making better use of what we already have. So the next time you prune a tree or clean up after a windy day, do not be in a hurry to throw those branches away. Walk through your garden first and ask yourself where one simple natural touch could make the space feel a little more welcoming for you. Your plants, the birds, and the helpful insects that quietly work beside you every day. I have a feeling you will discover ideas that are even better than mine. And if you do, keep exploring, because there are many more forgotten gardening methods that deserve to be remembered, and I cannot wait to share another one with you in the next video.